Audio. Hello. Okay. Mark?
Testing, testing.
Are you on?
I'm on. The green light's on.
Okay.
Testing.
Okay, here we go. All right. Well, hi, everybody. It's great to see everybody here. I'm Rand Hoppe. I am the collections manager here at the shelter, at the museum, and I'm on the board at the shelter. And just in the museum, we've been had this exhibit here, the fires, since January, curated by Chris Lopez. And I remember at the opening, our director, Bob Foster, talked to Mark. This is Mark Singleton, and said, let's have an event. So here we are. And Mark, you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. I guess the reason Bob asked me is I've been a volunteer at the Hoboken Shelter since 1985. And so I'm currently the longest standing volunteer. It's just because I don't have anything better to do, I guess. But no, it's been a great joy in my life and a wonderful part. I've served on the board of directors for more than 20 years. I've served as president, vice president, and other roles. So I've been around the Hoboken Shelter for a very long time. So it made sense that we sort of did this today.
Yeah, we did something like this in 2017, and we just felt like, let's do that again with a special, an added twist to it, years of experience, but a lot of the same pictures, because I just fired up the same presentation, but it was good then, and it'll be good now. So, but I just thought it is kind of more of a reminiscence of Mark is kind of driving what we're talking about. So there's the great shot, right?
I asked Ren to put this up because this is a legitimate picture of my childhood. This is really what my childhood looked like. But before we get started, I also just wanted to take a minute to thank Bob and to thank Rand and to thank Chris for this exhibit. It's a beautiful exhibit, and I think it's a very important exhibit because it covers a time in Hoboken's history that not a lot of people know about, and some people who know about it would rather forget about it, and other people really need to learn about it because this is part of our history. So, when Chris made a presentation at the Hoboken Shelter Board and I spent some time in this room, it sort of stirred some stuff up in me. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about what it was like growing up in Hoboken during this period. My family moved here in 1970, My family moved here in 1970, and Hoboken was a very different place back then. I often describe it as a cross between the Our Gang comedies and West Side Story. And it was kind of like that for a kid growing up in Hoboken at the time. I was 9 when we moved here. And if I look back and think about my childhood, and I think about some of those sort of Proustian memories, those smells that I remember from my childhood, the smells that I remember in Hoboken as a child were the coffee from Maxwell House coffee plant. That was everywhere, especially on an overcast day. The smell of roach spray, believe it or not. If I smell bug spray today, it still brings me back to my childhood. Back then, everyone sprayed the same chemical around, and there was a company called La Bomba Atomica that literally went around and sprayed every building in Hoboken, and that spray still evokes my childhood memories. And the third, of course, was fires. There were a lot of fires in Hoboken. This exhibit covers the period from 1978 to 1982, but it wasn't just that period. I went to branch school in 1973, and one of my first memories was marching with the children in my school when I was in the 5th grade at the time, and planting a tree in Elysian Park because it was for somebody in branch school who had died during that fire in 1973. And during that fire in 1973, 11 people died. 40 families were left homeless, and 160 people were displaced. That's the fire on the corner of 11th and Willow that's now a parking lot. It's that building there in 1973. There were also lots of other fires. I mean, I remember a fire at Mazarski's hardware store on 6th and Washington, a fire at Mount Olive Baptist Church, and the fire in the Leavenworth factory. So Hoboken was, in fact, burning. And that smell of fires will always be in my nose and in my memories whenever I smell it. Sometimes even to this day when, somebody in a brownstone fires up a wood-burning stove in the wintertime, it brings back those memories for me. So, this was just such an important part of who we are as a culture. And it was, as a kid, I remember having nightmares about fires. I remember planning escape routes in my house, how to get out. And, I was just a nice white kid living in a middle-class home in a brownstone. So it was very different. But even at me, it did affect me at that time. And I remember working in Hank's Deli when I was a kid. And Hank's Deli was a place where a lot of local police and firemen hung out. And during those days, the firemen, I remember some policemen coming back after the Pinter's fire on 14th Street and seeing these grown men who were very tough Hoboken cops crying because they had seen women jumping from windows and throwing their babies from windows. It was really a very impactful time, as you can imagine. So, it was just one of those things, and I think it's important to remember that this exhibit covers, to remember January 1979, 21 people died at 131 Clinton Street. In October 1981, 11 people died on 12th and Washington in the El Dorado fire. And in April of 1982, 13 people died in the Pinter fire on 14th Street. That was just one little snapshot, and which is why I really think it's so important that the museum is doing this. And also, I wanted to thank Elaine Thomas from All Saints for spearheading a public memorial. More people died in Hoboken in fires than died during 9/11. Now, I don't mean to combine those two events, right? They're very different, but more Hoboken residents died in this period during fires than Hoboken residents who died during 9/11, and I think they deserve a memorial that's fitting to that time in our history. So, it's a good start, and there's so much more to come. So, this was my childhood, and it was a childhood that was, really great in many, many ways, but it was on the backdrop of this time in our history. The most important smell during that time, of course, was fear. It's important to remember how much fear was involved. And, we'll hear later, and if you look around, you'll hear about groups like Por la Gente, which was formed by Sister Norberta and others. They literally would have rooftop watches during this period to look up, be on the lookout for arson. There were hundreds and thousands of people who went to bed every night wondering if they were safe. And so that's an important part of our history. It's part of our legacy. So it's important that we remember that at all times. And we remember people like Sister Norberta, Louis Lopez, April Harris. These are people who were on the front lines at a time when people were really, really in need. Sister Norberta you'll see her later in the presentation, she was a sister of charity, a local nun. I mean, she would literally put herself in front of bulldozers. I mean, that's the kind of nun she was. She would lay down in front of bulldozers, and she was just that kind of a person. So, I just wanted to sort of give that to some of the context when we start talking about the Hoboken Shelter, because that's what was going on in Hoboken at the time, but it's not the only thing. From 1970, when my family moved in, until 1979, when I graduated from high school, Hoboken changed a lot. People started moving in and buying brownstones. My family bought a brownstone on 9th and Bloomfield Street in 1970 for $22,000, and they were literally the laughing stock of the block. I looked it up, and in 2000, in current dollars, that's about $175,000. So, even now, you couldn't buy very much for that, as you know. So, but things started to change, and Rand we have some slides to look at that change.
Yeah, we've got just a little bit of the old, what was going on here in the waterfront, right here. I think this photo's from the 40s, and it's just significant industrial activity and jobs. So there was so much going on that kept Hoboken going. It was and an engine of industry here, and here's the the downtown piers, which what was going on. It's Pier A now on the right, and the non-existent Pier B and Pier C and so on. So there was just so much going on, and that so many people were living here, working here, that but soon enough it all changed, and this is one of my favorite things that I found in the collection here, which was a pamphlet created by the Hoboken Chamber of Commerce that I gather they sent out to other cities and chambers of commerces, saying, don't let the federal government own a lot of property in your town because you lose the tax revenue. So what happened was that it ended up, the piers ended up being owned by the Port Authority downtown, and that was kind of like, they were seeing not a lot of revenue on the city's books. So it was a problem. But this is the kind of stuff that these are photos in our collection from Red Barrett of what was going on, and the piers. This people, humans amongst goods, with hooks and saying go here and go there. Was not very mechanical. People were at risk. But what happened in the 50s, the late 50s and early 60s, we had a great lecture here earlier about it, was containerization. So containers were invented, and that changed the shipping industry, which caused, this is actually a photo of some container infrastructure on the Hoboken-Weehawken border. Sealand, the company, set up this. This is one of the, I don't know what it's called, a derrick, I don't know, something to pick the containers up and put them on trucks. It didn't last very long because of our roads. And the trains, so it all just moved to Elizabeth and Newark. And that's what happened to Brooklyn too. And so again, we just lost we just lost all that shipping.
And the Hudson River really wasn't deep enough for some of the larger container
Correct,
ships
that's right.
that were coming in as well. So there was a problem with our infrastructure.
So what happened, we a lot of people we had the Puerto Ricans coming to the U.S. after World War II for work. Well, then, the work dried up. This is one of my favorite Carolyn Carlson photos from the Puerto Rican Day Parade in 1975 outside. That Gales is now Johnny Rockets. Yeah, so love the straw hats, the whole thing. And then a woman there in curlers. It's the best. It's just like, I'm going to go watch the parade. But here's Hoboken.
Yeah. I think it's important not to underestimate how derelict the housing stock had become for a lot of Hobokens, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s through that time. There were vacant buildings in Hoboken throughout. We also had a lot of tenement buildings that we call cold water flats, that sort of, were certainly not up to code. They were built a long time ago. They also had dumbwaiters, which acted as they were great for transporting goods up and down, but during a fire, what it did is cause a fire that could start in the basement to go right to the top floor in about a minute. And the
cold water flat, that was you had a heater in your stove in your kitchen.
It just meant that the landlord provided cold water to the unit. You did everything else past there, so you made your own heat and hot water in the unit.
Yeah.
So you had heating systems and gas space heaters in apartments and very old buildings.
This is the yellow flats right here at like 13th and Washington, but in progress of being renovated, I think, by Applied Housing.
And it's important to remember, even though those buildings were derelict, there were thousands of families living in those buildings, right? They were living in buildings that were substandard. They were paying very low rent. It was affordable housing. But again, they were living dangerously, so to speak. And then the brownstone movement started in the early 70s, because Hoboken does have a beautiful housing stock as well.
Yeah.
Those brownstones are just gorgeous.
It's city living. It's good, a good infrastructure in a way. But what happened were things like this, which was we have these kinds of articles. We have a video in our library in the back, the Sinatra Lounge in the back. They don't make fun of Hoboken anymore, which is like, we had somebody here in the museum a few weeks ago. She said, "I saw that. They don't laugh at Hoboken anymore, and I moved here because of it. Because it was on PBS."
Yeah. And if you look at the bottom of the banner there, it says "friendly neighborhoods," right?
Yeah.
Safe streets.
Yep.
And bargain brownstones. That's what it says. And that was a lot of that.
There's Washington Street,
Yeah.
1975, I think. But there's the word Renaissance, but what does that mean for the people who were already living there? And there's a lot of concerns about that. This is so Por la Gente, the organization, the people there collated fantastic scrapbooks. We feature them here in our display here. We've featured them in other exhibits. They're just wonderful record of news clippings. I think there's 4 of them. 1982 arson, 1982 rent control, 1983 arson. But we're just it's such an honor to be able to have them in our collection. And I did find first condo, 1981. And, it was the Hudson Muse, as you called it.
That's what it was called, yeah.
It's First and
Hudson.
And Hudson, yeah, First and Hudson. So that's, Gerino's and the Stenick building down there. And it's just, it was happening. But the one thing, so here's the Clergy Coalition that was founded, but really what was happening? Talk about the SROs.
Yeah, so a couple things were happening in town. Certainly this period that we're talking about here, it was going on. And, there was, all of a sudden, buildings had value in Hoboken for the first time. There was indeed certainly arson for profit that happened in town. That's a fact. And we're not going to get too much into that today. But just let it be said that buildings that were virtually valueless all of a sudden had a whole lot of value. And a building that's vacant is a lot more valuable than a building that has people living in it. That's just a fact. And, many landlords, use whatever means necessary to get buildings vacant. So that was happening, certainly. And there were people that were displaced through that process. Also, as Rand mentioned, containerized shipping came in, longshoremen and merchant marines, who were a big part of the older population, were living in SROs down in the First Ward, down near City Hall on Garden and Park.
It's single room occupancy.
Right. So, if you go into many brownstones today, you'll still see deadbolts on doors on the 3rd floor. And you say, why is there a deadbolt on the door on the 3rd floor? Because they were being used as SROs. And the city of Hoboken began to crack down on them because they were unsafe and they were sort of hotels, so to speak, but they weren't following any regulations. And so those people started being emptied out and those buildings were closed. There was a man named Lieber who owned 10 or 20 buildings in the First Ward, I think. And, hundreds and hundreds of people lived in those SROs. They were suddenly homeless.
They were homeless, yeah.
So there was a whole bunch of things happening all at once, and other people were just left behind by the Renaissance that we're talking about here. So I guess the other thing to point out that, buildings in Hoboken, 10 filling buildings, people wanted to convert them to condominium, as Rand pointed out before. There's a 5-year moratorium on evictions for condominiums. So if you bought a building and wanted to convert it to condominiums, you needed to allow your current tenants to stay there for 5 years before you could ask them to leave. No developer that I knew of wanted to wait 5 years for that. So in the best of worlds, they negotiated deals with tenants, and some of that is covered in the movie Delivered Vacant. We're going to see a little bit of later on. And of course, some of it led to the things that this display is about. But suddenly there were new homeless in Hoboken. And, people stepped up. And I have to say that who stepped up were people of faith. People stepped up. The churches and the synagogues all stepped up. April Harris and In Jesus' Name Charity started feeding people. And then slowly, there was this Lutheran church on 3rd and Bloomfield Street, and they started feeding people. I wasn't there yet. And, suddenly that feeding became like people needed a place to stay. So this building was a Lutheran church. It's one of the oldest church buildings in Hoboken. It's on 300 Bloomfield Street. And the congregation had shrunk and was fairly small at the time, and they opened up their building and allowed this feeding to happen on the corner of 3rd and Bloomfield Street. And guess what? People needed a place to stay, so they let people stay. And, you know, first they opened a soup kitchen, and I have to say the soup kitchen is still the heart of the Hoboken Shelter. Always was, always will be. It's how it started, and it's probably how it will end. I mean, you know, we feed 250 meals a day in the place. It's all food. It's all about food.
I thought it was 500.
Well, 500. 500. I don't.
That's on my slide at the end. That's all.
On the, so the pastors in these organizations, in the clergy coalition that we saw in that slide, started staying overnight. They would take turns staying overnight and allowing people to sleep in this building on 300 Bloomfield Street. So the clergy coalition for the homeless opened our shelter in 1983 is the date that we count as our formation, but it's important to remember that there were other things that were happening at the same time. There were these other organizations. There was a campaign for housing justice that was spearheaded by a man named Tommy Oliveri, who the park on Willow Avenue was named after. He was one of the greatest men that ever lived.
He was, yeah. And the people, well, yeah, all right.
So guess what they did we opened up in 1983, started serving people, people stayed overnight. The first thing the city did was send this letter. And I don't know if you can read it up there, but the letter saying, what are you doing? You cannot have a shelter on 300 Bloomfield Street. There's a zoning ordinance in the city of Hoboken, and sheltering is not one of the allowable uses within the zone of 3rd and Bloomfield Street. So please stop immediately, and if you don't, you're going to get fined hundreds and hundreds of dollars a day. So the city of Hoboken came down and shut us down. And so, you know, people were concerned what to do. And so they hired people like Jeff Curtis and Sister Norberta and Claire Nicoletti and a bunch of other people got together and hired some pro bono attorneys and went to court. And we sought an immediate restraining order to stop the city from closing us down, and we asked for an immediate injunction from that.
We've got some news from the New Jersey Network. So I think it's like 2 minutes. So let's just, hopefully it'll all work out here.
By day, many of Hoboken's homeless sit on the steps of City Hall, but at night they need a place to sleep and a meal. Right now, they can get both at St. John's Lutheran Church, but not for long if the city has its way.
Bottom line is that the community was up in arms about this attracting derelict homeless people. I don't think that you're going to find any community allowing them to come into a residential area.
I don't want to be close because it's going to close the church. What are we going to stay there here like a beggar?
But the mayor says neighbors are complaining loudly.
Well, it's no good for the kids. It's no good for the people around here because they're around here like, you know, they're begging for money. They're bad for the neighborhood.
As long as it doesn't interfere with anybody else's lives, they are entitled to it. I don't mind it.
The shelter, which is subsidized by the state and federal governments, feeds about 50 people a night and sleeps 30 to 35. The city says that violates the zoning laws.
Principal permitted uses of the zone do not call for hotel, motel, or boarding houses, which this would come under that jurisdiction from the state construction codes.
Tomorrow, Arrizzo plans to inspect the church to see if it violates any other city or state codes before the dispute goes back to court on Thursday.
We believe wholeheartedly that we are entitled to run a shelter. We believe also that the city does have the responsibility to come in and tell us what codes we need to comply with and how to operate. But that is not a zoning question.
In this report issued last week, the National Coalition for the Homeless called New Jersey's resources shockingly insufficient. According to this report, there are only 700 emergency beds in the entire state. If St. John's is forced to close down, that will mean 35 fewer beds and at least 50 people back out on the streets. In Hoboken, I'm Marcy Reitman.
So that was actually from the time. And, you know, what happened was we presented, the Hoboken Clergy Coalition, mostly Jeff Curtis and Triff Felsky and Sister Norberta, hired this attorney and went into the Superior Court of the state of New Jersey and made a case that's saying the city of Hoboken can't stop a church from sheltering people. The churches have been sheltering people since the medieval times. The churches are, in fact, places of sanctuary. They don't need any special zoning to be so. And we went to court. And we got a decision from a judge whose real name was Burl Ives Humphreys. He was the assignment judge at the time. People in Hudson County knew him. He was a great jurist in town, and he basically agreed with everything that we said. That citing case law going back to the Magna Carta, citing biblical quotations, he said he gave it a decision that said the city of Hoboken cannot stop a church from having a shelter anywhere, and that sheltering is in the very nature of what churches are. So that was a wonderful, wonderful decision. And I got to tell you, that decision is still being used every year by scores of churches throughout the country to open churches in municipalities that are hostile to them. I was speaking to a Lutheran pastor from Rahway just last week, and they started sheltering people in Rahway, and the city came down on them. They're using our decision in their case. So Hoboken is responsible for that landmark decision that is still being used today. So it's why we'll always have a church at 300 Bloomfield Street. And this is Sister Norberta Honeywinkle. She was a sister of charity, a really great woman, and she was our second executive director at the Hoboken Shelter. And this is from the movie Delivered Vacant. Hopefully we get some signs.
The reason why we don't see the same thing as we would in an earthquake or a flood is because people get displaced gradually over the time. They stay with friends for a while, they're very optimistic about getting a place, and then finally their welcome wears out between the families and friends, and then they're homeless.
It's because of the New Yorkers coming in is pushing us out. Yeah, coming into town and buying the property and pushing out the Hobokenites.
Are you resentful? Do you have anger towards these New Yorkers?
I do very much. I thought you were a New Yorker. I really did. I thought you were a New Yorker.
Right.
So sorry for the less than perfect video, but audio. But those were the early days of the Hoboken Shelter. It was kind of down and dirty. Early on, as I said, that pastors and other people did take turns staying overnight to watch the place, and that was 40 years ago. We just celebrated our 40th anniversary last June. We just served our
3 million.
3 millionth meal at the Hoboken Shelter. And we're still operating strong. And the Hoboken Shelter has been, in my experience, a place that is not only a place of refuge for people, but it's a transformational place for so many people. We also have around 10,000 individual volunteers who come and serve at the Hoboken Shelter in any given year. So the Hoboken Shelter changes people's lives. And by that, I don't mean homeless people. I mean lots of people's lives. I think it is literally the premier social service institution in this city, and the city of Hoboken would be much poorer without it. So it's been very, very, I've been very proud to be associated with the place. Yeah.
And this is, was it Carol?
Yeah.
Claire,
Nicola.
Claire,
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah, there's Sister Norberta again. Again, Sister Norberta used to stay out all night and watching for arson fires, and she was on the front lines. This is Jacqueline Cherubini, who's our current executive director. I served on the committee that brought Jacqueline here, and I'm very proud of that. She's been she's a wonderful, wonderful person, and has turned the shelter from a much smaller organization to an organization that's now open 365 days a year. 50 people stay overnight every night. We serve 500 meals a day. We allow 1,000 showers a week. It's the only place in Hoboken where homeless men and women, street-dwelling men and women, can come and shower. Every week we have that. And again, and on and on. And it's not just about shelter. We also have literacy programs. We have resume writing workshops. We have computer skills workshops. We help hundreds of people get their benefits in order. A lot of people who are experiencing homelessness right now are actually entitled to benefits that they can't get access to because they need ID. Now, it sounds easy for me and you to go get a piece of ID, but it's not. So we have a wonderful staff at the Hoboken Shelter now. The Hoboken Shelter has grown from that small organization to an organization with $1 million a year budget. We have 18 full-time employees. We have caseworkers. We have people who work outside. We also help administer 22 units of what we call permanent and supportive housing. So they are Section 8 vouchers, mostly in Jersey City, unfortunately, because that's where they exist.
Plus the veterans.
Plus the veterans in Hoboken.
40.
Yep.
It's 40,
It's
40 vouchers.
40 vouchers total. And we provide the skills and the help that those people need to be successful in their new apartments. And that's done through the social work of a lot of very dedicated people at the Hoboken Shelter. So, you know, the Hoboken Shelter is more than just a place where people sleep. And I think that I've been saying lately, I kind of feel like we're almost entering a new culture war in Hoboken. And I think some of you have probably seen it. There's a lot of negative chatter online about homelessness and about, you know, panhandling on Washington Street. And, you know, if anyone's been to Panera's or the Third and Washington Starbucks these days, you'll see some of the impact of that. Those two businesses have removed all of their furniture. So, you know, and I think that as Hoboken has gone this next level of gentrification, I mean, we now have brownstones in Hoboken that are selling for $5 and $6 million. And, you know, we still have this population in town. And again, it's important to remember that at any given time at the Hoboken Shelter, 25% of the people who are in the building and interact with the building are born and raised in Hoboken. Another 25% grew up within a mile of Hoboken. Jersey City Heights, Union City, Weehawken, and probably another 20% or so are from Hudson County in general, bordering into Essex County. These are not those people, these are our people. These are Hoboken people. And again, we get people from all over the world. The Hoboken Shelter sees young kids from Kansas who, you know, young trans kids who have been asked to leave by their parents end up in Hoboken. People from all over the world have come to Hoboken, to the Hoboken Shelter. It's been a place of refuge. I've known people from Africa, from Asia, you know, and it's just amazing. And I see Spike back there. Spike is one of the people who works at the Hoboken Shelter, our caseworker. And Hamis is here, and Robin is here, and Bill is here. I mean, there's so many people that make this happen. So.
That's my last slide.
Okay. So it's important to remember that these are Hoboken people. And this is Hoboken's history, and these people are experiencing Hoboken's history. And, you know, I know it's difficult, and I'm not, you know, I think one of the reasons I'm really proud that the Hoboken Clergy Coalition still exists and that the churches and the synagogue in Hoboken are still advocating so strongly for homeless men and women and hungry men and women is because they're providing a service that the city of Hoboken really has not been providing. It's fallen on individuals and on houses of faith to do this and to fill these gaps. And they're filling it in a really valuable way. The Hoboken Shelter is funded. We do receive funds from FEMA funds. About a third of our funding comes from federal and state sources. About a third of our funding comes from foundations and other sort of private entities like that. And a third of our funding comes from people like you. We have 4 major fundraisers a year. We have to raise about $350,000 to keep the door of the Hoboken Shelter open every single year. And again, the people of Hoboken have been overwhelmingly welcoming and great and generous to us. But I do think that we're coming into a period now where we're going to have to stand up again as people of faith and a people of goodwill for people who are less fortunate than ourselves. Because there are a lot of people who wish there were no homeless in Hoboken. And whenever somebody says to me, we really have to do something about that homelessness problem, I said, I agree. We really need to get some more homes. Because that is the answer for homeless.
That's the answer.
So, I don't know if we have a...
We have a Q&A session. If anybody has any questions or anything? We're going to do microphones, though.
Yep.
So.
As you were speaking, just came to mind. I don't know if it'd be something that your organization would be interested in supporting in any way, but and I know it's Jersey City, but like you said, many homeless people in Hoboken are from Jersey City. There's a campaign for right to counsel in Jersey City, which evictions is one of the leading causes of homelessness, and there's a number of cities and states around the country that have passed legislation that provide free lawyers for tenants whenever they're facing evictions or other issues with their landlords. And it's been very effective in stemming the tide of evictions. But anyway, so there's a campaign for a right to counsel in Jersey City. If the Hoboken Shelter or the Closure Coalition be interested in supporting that, it'd probably be really great.
Absolutely, we should talk afterwards. Yep. I mean, having access to legal representation is very, very important. Yep.
Oh, you do, because people are watching online.
I had a question too. Hi, thank you so much for this. I'd like you to, if you could characterize the population that you have right now and how has that changed at all? I understand the evictions during the fires, and there's of course a lot of evictions now, and I'm concerned in Hoboken as well with the development that we have. There's too many tear downs of buildings that are rent controlled, that people have been renting for years, and then for fancy apartments that people can buy once a new building is built. And can you hear me? Sorry. Okay. And so I'm concerned about not just the culture issue in Hoboken, but also the fact that we are becoming extra gentrified, as you said, and what's happening with the people that are being evicted, in the coming years, that will be once these buildings are torn down. And can you talk a little about the divisions between men and women, the differences, causes between men and women, if there are any differences?
Yeah, absolutely. When I first started the Hoboken Shelter, it was mostly men and a few women, and that is the biggest change. We now have equal numbers of men and women at the Hoboken Shelter. Vast majority we have a lot of senior citizens. We have lots of people who raised families and, did a really good job, worked their whole lives and raised families that now are in this situation and experiencing homelessness, so that's changed a lot. And you're actually absolutely right about the other issues as well. The fact of the matter is Hoboken has an ordinance on its books called the Inclusionary Ordinance, which requires developers to set aside 10% of any housing for affordable housing. The fact is that ordinance has been ignored for decades. Some money has been thrown into affordable housing trust funds, which is then distributed in weird ways. I know that the current administration is talking about that again, and in the new developments that are happening, they're trying to do a better job of that. But you're absolutely right. Hoboken has always had a lot of affordable housing thanks to organizations like Applied Housing, who is our landlord here, and they renovated a lot of buildings back in the 70s with federal funding, and in return for very inexpensive loans from the federal government, they agreed to keep those loans affordable for the life of the loan. The fact is those loans have almost or matured now, and so most of those buildings are being converted from affordable to market rate housing. So this does continue, and it doesn't continue with fires or other things, but yeah, it is continuing. That's a very good point. Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that we found a lot lately is we have a lot of young kids. A lot of young kids. I mean, as we all know about the opioid crisis and the drug crisis we're experiencing in America. We have a lot more young kids, and those young kids bring young problems with them. And there's often some interaction between the young and the old that can be difficult in the shelter to deal with. And again, as a shelter, as you can imagine, we deal with all kinds of issues, from drug addiction to alcoholism to mental illness, all different kinds of things. And we were having a forum once, and somebody asked Jacqueline, what do they think is the main cause of homelessness? And, people rattled off things like that, drug addiction, and Jacqueline said, in her opinion, the number one cause of homelessness in this country is family separation. And I think she's right, because we probably all know families that have dealt with drug addiction in their family. We know families that have dealt with a mentally ill member of their family, and with an intact family that's supportive, those issues are dealt with well. But when families get separated and people are separated from that support, they end up with us.
Hi, Mark, how are you?
Hey.
I just wanted to point out something my girlfriend told me maybe 20 years ago when she lived in New York. She was separated from her husband. She had a very young child, and she had very little gas in her car. And she said to me, because of her circumstances, she's someone who went to college and everything, she said, anybody could become homeless. It doesn't take 3 months. It doesn't take 3 days. It can take 3 seconds or 3 minutes. And I think we all saw that during Sandy, I mean, during COVID. It's just something to think about, and anybody could become homeless. I could become homeless easily. Somebody very wealthy could become homeless easily. And I also wanted to point out that when you see a homeless person on the street, don't be afraid. Someone told me once that I was too friendly with homeless people. Don't be afraid. Maybe ask them how they're doing. Ask them if they need something, if they need a water, or a cup of soup. Don't ask them anything else. Ask them if they have medical care, if they need socks or underwear, things like that.
Yeah.
And also, thanks to St. Matthew's for their monthly dinner that we host for our guests. I mean, it's been so moving and changing for me. It's added. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. And you're absolutely right. I always tell people how I got involved at the Hoboken Shelter. I went on a whim one day with a friend of mine who was a chef. And, you know, I graduated Hoboken High in 1979, and this was in 1985, so 6 years later. And when we went to serve dinner, there were 3 kids from my high school class on the other side of the bread line. I freaked out. I went back into the kitchen. I didn't go out and serve dinner that night, but it cemented a relationship with the place. And again, as Patricia just said, it made me realize that anyone can be homeless, and many people in this country are one emergency away from needing our services. In the back.
I noticed that you said you have 50 beds nightly, but you serve 500 meals daily. What happens to the people who don't have beds at night? Where do they go?
Well, that's a good question. And so the fact is we turn away people every single night at the Hoboken Shelter, just about. Some good news, though. Back in the, I guess it was the 90s, someone I went to high school with, you know, I always recall his name just because it's important. His name was Tippy Taglieri. His name was, and he died in front of City Hall, froze to death in front of City Hall one night. And Jacqueline, who's our executive director, working with the county officials, started a winter shelter initiative. So thank God that at least from the months of, I think it's October 1st until April 1st, right? Yeah, March 30th. Depends on the weather. There's a bus that comes and picks up anyone who wants to get on it and takes them to a warehouse in Kearney to at least get out of the cold for the night. We don't pick people up and force them. Hoboken and New Jersey and New York are very different. You probably heard news reports about the city going around and picking up homeless people in New York. They have a different constitution than we have. The Constitution of New York makes the city of New York responsible for the health and safety of their residents. Our Constitution doesn't do that. So they can voluntarily get in a bus and we take them there. But the fact of the matter is, lots of people sleep in the terminal at night. Lots of people sleep in the parks. If you go onto the hills that are behind Hoboken, there are whole communities of people that live up there. They're, you know, every once in a while they take down their tents and they move them, and people repopulate. So there are people living on the streets every night in the city of Hoboken. I'm sorry.
Just follow up. Do you think it's beneficial? You mentioned that you had a lot of other shelters sending people here, but yet the Hoboken Shelter can't even accommodate the people that are already there. Is it beneficial to still have other shelters send people here when there's really no room for them, and they might actually wind up on the street here?
Yeah, we don't ask people to send anyone here. Trust me, they do send people here. We've actually had cases in the last couple of months where people have put a patient in a taxi, in an Uber from Monmouth County and sent them to the Hoboken Shelter. And they just come to our door with a hospital bracelet on. And here you go. And so no, but you're absolutely right. There are 3 shelters in Hudson County. There's the Hoboken Shelter, there's the Catholic Charities Shelter at St. Lucy's, and then there's the Perk Shelter up in Union City. Those are the only 3 shelters. They each have about 100 beds each, about 300 beds in total. That's it for Hudson County. And this for true emergency shelter beds. We do a point and count time every year. There are at least 5,000 to 6,000 homeless men and women in Hudson County on any given day. So obviously we need much more, you know, but we're trying to do other things. So we have an emergency shelter, but we're doing a lot. I mean, the Hoboken Shelter is very proud that we move hundreds of people every year from the street into our shelter and then into their own home. Not always a permanent, not always a great place, but something between the YMCA and reuniting with family. Our goal is to eliminate homelessness by moving people out of off the street into our shelter and then into a home. That's what we try to do. And we do a pretty good job of it. Joe.
My dad was born here in 1900, and my brother was born in 36, and I was born in 45, and we've been curious to know how many people have been living in Hoboken over all that time as a family.
Yeah, it's a really good story. It's a good question. And population changes in Hoboken. When we talked about the 70s, I think Hoboken's population back then was 23 or 24,000. Right now, it's
getting close to 60.
Yeah, just 60,000, and in the Depression it was 75,000. But of course, during that time, you wouldn't want to go back to that. That was people were living all different kinds of ways back then. But yeah, Hoboken has had a population explosion, and Hoboken's been a very famous, a great place. People passed through Hoboken. It was the point of debarkation for World War I. Everyone knows Hoboken. We're famous from Bugs Bunny cartoons to movies. Yeah. Yes.
What happens to children who are homeless?
So we are not a children's shelter. We're not a family shelter in Hoboken. Hudson County does have family shelters, and so there are shelters in Jersey City, Hope House, and other places where families or women mostly with young children can go. There aren't many family shelters, and that's a big need in the shelter world. So there are organizations like Family Promise that have tried to fill that gap by keeping families together. Because very often the only way for a family to be housed if they're experiencing homelessness is to be split up. And the children end up in foster care. The children end up in other places. Hudson County is very, good about saying no child is homeless in Hoboken, but that doesn't mean they're together with their family. So there's a great need for that. But it's not a need we fulfill at the Hoboken Shelter. You need to be 18. You need to be sober. You need to be working on your goals. The Hoboken Shelter is a very safe place. We have high standards for our guests. You can't come in and misbehave because we know that one person can really influence many other people when you have a communal living situation like that. And just one other thing to rant a little bit. The Hoboken Shelter gets blamed for all issues, homelessness in Hoboken, right? I mean, I literally, we got a call one time from a woman who lives in Willow Terrace, right down by the Acme, because somebody had defecated outside her house. And so she called the Hoboken Shelter and said to complain. I mean, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that call. But we do get blamed for a lot, and we do try, but we have to understand that there are people who are beyond our help as well. There are people who have never come into the doors of the Hoboken Shelter and choose to stay outside. There are people suffering from severe mental illness. There are lots of issues that are going on, and I know it's not easy on a community, but I do believe that, as Joe pointed out, Hoboken is such a rich place because of our diversity and because of the millions of different kinds of people who have come through here. And I believe that the Hoboken Shelter is a part of that fabric, and it makes Hoboken what's great.
When you talk about, thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Mark. It was a wonderful presentation. So first of all, thank you. I learned a lot. You mentioned, and I'm very upset about, the Panera and Starbucks emptying out, and apparently they can, because they're such big corp, they can handle having, very few people in their businesses. And I'm on the board of the library, which also, has a lot of, and also has been doing some excellent outreach with social work with the shelter. Yeah, on council. But anyway, I'm not here to, it's. So the shelter, people have to leave the shelter in the morning. What? Because I haven't been able to put my head around it. But what's the best daytime? Is there a best case daytime solution? From somewhere else in the country or something that we could adopt? Are there activities? Is there something that I don't know?
That's a real good question. First of all, thanks to the Hoboken Library. The Hoboken Library is a real partner in our work, and we're very, very happy with that. Hasn't always been the case, but it really is now, and it's wonderful, wonderful. So that's great. Yeah, I mean, look, it's not a corporate decision. This was a local decision. I mean, there's a Panera's and there's a Starbucks on 42nd Street that's open with furniture. Right, so I think it was a short-sighted decision, and I understand it was difficult. That some businesses in Hoboken are having an undue burden because of the homeless population, be that as it may. But you're absolutely right. By the way, the Hoboken Shelter only closes for an hour now. We're open 24. So we used to close during the daytime, and people would leave. We don't. So we close in the morning to clean and sanitize, but we're open, and we have a room full of people all day, and the reason, and people need to remember that too, because it's a very good point. If the Hoboken Shelter weren't here, as some people would prefer, there would be no place for those people to go, but there's not enough room. You're absolutely right. So people tend to find places there, and people our guests find places of sanctuary where they can. Emergency room, waiting rooms, the waiting room at the train station. Those places are really, really important, and I understand it's not their job to do this, but these people do need some place to get out of the weather. The Hoboken Shelter is the only, is a warming center and a cooling center when needed. Sometimes it's the only one in town. Sometimes the city of Hoboken calls on us to be that, and we do that. So yeah, it's a real good point, because people don't have a place to go. And they don't have a place to go to the bathroom. And so, that the city has decreased the number of public bathrooms, not increased them. If you go look at any bench in Hoboken, instead of being flat, it now has dividers. Those dividers are purely to make people uncomfortable. That's what they're there. They're a pure form of not hospitality. I get it. But that's what it's about. I'm sorry, I can't think of anything else. And one of the initiatives we're doing at the Hoboken Shelter now is a Change for Change campaign, right? Because what happened was that my sister called me one day and said, "Mark, did you guys write this sign?" There was a sign on a local business that said, "Do not give money to those people panhandling outside. They're drug addicts. They'll rob you. They're horrible people. Call the Hoboken Shelter." It's like, and so it's like, no, we didn't write that. I promise you we didn't write that. But what it was, they were trying at the end to do something nice, but, so we're trying to educate businesses and educate people about, rather than giving spare change to a homeless person, give change to an organization that promotes change. Give money to the Hoboken Shelter or other feeding organizations. There are others in town as well, by the way, that feed people. Do something to make change. And if you feel so called, give money to a homeless person. We've had some meetings with public officials and outraged residents sometimes, and what often comes up in these meetings is they think that the Hoboken Shelter is too nice and the people in Hoboken are too generous. Those are the two best solutions that some of our politicians can come up with. And the reason being is because Hoboken is they say it's very profitable. People are coming from all over the country to beg in Hoboken because we're so generous. And the Hoboken Shelter is too nice, as if anyone ever dreamed of living in the Hoboken Shelter. So that's another thing. And so, yeah. And, I had a police officer once say to me, and he was a friend and who I knew very well, it's like, you think you're helping people, Mark, but you're really not, because it's kind of like stray dogs. If you feed them, they'll keep coming back. Excuse me? I was shocked. I didn't know what to say, but it is a prevailing attitude. And luckily I was there with my pastor, and it was in a church. And what I said was that as a Christian, I believe it's our calling to feed people who are hungry, and that we will do this forever. And as long as we're open, we're going to feed people. That's what I said. So it's an interesting time in our country. Homelessness is continuing. Millions of people experience food insecurity every single day. It's just true. It's difficult. And, the Hoboken Shelter, if I can leave you with anything, just to really know that the Hoboken Shelter is part of the solution, not part of the problem. Sometimes we get painted into that corner of being part of the problem. We're not. If the Hoboken Shelter didn't exist, more people would be hungry. More people would be sleeping on the street and sitting on park benches, and most importantly, Hoboken wouldn't be the city that I love and that you love. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.